Hello everyone, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I don't claim that my builds are the best in the game, and I'm sure there are better ways to optimize some of them, but be aware that I do tend to get my builds at least endgame viable. This includes things like arbitration, steel path, Eidolon hunts, etc. Now that this is out of the way, these timestamps have been left here and in the description for your convenience. Feel free to skip around, but I'll start with the basics first just in case people don't know how to play this frame. So starting with the stats. Armor is 225 for prime, 175 for non-prime. A 50-point increase puts you at 42.9% damage reduction and 36.8% respectively. For energy, we have 175 for prime, 150 for non-prime. This puts you at 262.5 and 225 respectively. For health, you're looking at 125 for both. This puts you at 375 at max. For shield, you're looking at a stock 100 for both. This puts you at 300 at max. For sprint speed, you're looking at a stock 1.0 for both. Regular Oberon comes from Grineer-controlled Proxima missions for Railjack. He comes from points of interest in the mission. Oberon Prime is currently vaulted at the creation of this video, so you'll either need to dust off some old relics or pay someone a pretty penny for it. Going on to abilities, starting with the passive. Allied pets receive 25% health, armor, and shield buffs. In addition, your pet receives an instant revive per mission. So this is pretty straightforward, not totally necessary because Vulpaphilas are the only regular pets worth using, and they revive themselves indefinitely if they go down anyway. This would be okay for Smedicavats, but Oberon isn't typically the frame of choice for farming runs. Moving into his first ability, Smite, focuses deadly energy within a target and then projects it outwards, damaging both the target and surrounding enemies. So you send a projectile out towards the target, which forces a radiation proc as well as a guaranteed knockdown. Radiation procs force targets affected to attack each other. It basically just turns on friendly fire. This will be important to know as most of his abilities are radiation. Additional projectiles come out from the main target, doing mostly puncture. The orb damage is determined by 35% of the main target's maximum health, and shields divided among the number of orbs. So, to explain this better, if I have an ancient with 58,636.48 health, and I hit them with Smite, with no additional power strength, 6 orbs will come out. So my orb is set to do 150 damage plus 35% of the health of the ancient, then divided by 6 because of the 6 orbs. Because of this, you'll have 150 plus 20,522.77, which is then divided by 6, which gives you 3,445.46. However, Ancients also resist 75% of that damage because it's radiation, so it'd actually be about 861. Warframe does a whole bunch of rounding and stuff in the background of the formulas, so it's hard to get an exact number, which is why the number was slightly different, but that is how it works. At the end of the day, if you need to cast this, only cast it on the BVS target you can find unless you're trying to reduce the damage of enemies around you. Puncture reduces the target's damage by 30%. In terms of using it as a damage ability, it's pretty pointless. All this trouble and math for damage that isn't even good after considering armor and resistances, to be honest. If this did true damage instead of cohering to damage reduction from armor, it may actually be decent. In all honesty, just shoot something with a Brahma or a Tsar or even the Tenant Envoy instead of using this for damage. That being said, the puncture procs it gives can be decent when modded for a bunch of strength, as it spawns a bunch of orbs, all causing puncture. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, initial damage, orb damage, and amount of orbs is affected by ability strength. The orbs actually have a duration before they dissipate, as they seek enemies. So if there are no enemies, they will disappear after a set duration, which is affected by ability duration. Cast range and homing range is affected by ability range. Moving on to his second ability, Hallowed Ground. Sanctifies the ground before Oberon with Righteous Fire, inflicting damage to any enemy that stands in flames. So Oberon puts some grass on the ground and an angle around him. Enemies standing on the grass take radiation every half second with a 15% status chance, which means it can make enemies want to attack each other. When allies stand on the grass, it removes status effects and makes it impossible to take knockdowns and future status effects. Unfortunately, if you are in the air above the grass, you will still take the status effects, so your feet pretty much need to be touching it. You can have up to 4 of these on the ground, and this ability synergizes with his third and fourth ability, which I will get into soon. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, angle and radius is affected by ability range, Duration is affected by ability duration. Damage and status chance is affected by ability strength.
Moving on to his third ability, Renewal. Healing waves of energy flow outward from Oberon to his allies, regenerating health over time. So the way this works is you press it and a wave goes out. Anybody hit with this wave will get an instant heal and to heal over time indefinitely until they reset, like falling off the edge of a map, or Oberon deactivates it. It even adds more time to the bleed out timer for those affected by it when they go down. The wave that gets sent out has its own range and gradually reaches that range. It reaches its max range faster if you have more ability strength. It drains energy over time and drains additional energy per target that is not at max health. So if you have 4 targets affected all at max health, it will take just the base amount and not per target. If 2 of them is under max health, it will drain more per target until they are at max health. So moving on to the synergy with Hallowed Ground, if targets run into Hallowed Ground while Renewal is on them, they get an armor buff. This buff remains indefinitely as long as Renewal is active. If they lose Renewal for any reason, the permanent armor buff turns into one that only lasts a set duration. For modding this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, while Drain per second and per target is affected by both ability efficiency and duration. Bleed Out Slow and buff duration for the armor buff when Renewal expires is also affected by ability duration. Radius of the wave is affected by ability range, while the duration of the wave reaching its max range faster is affected by ability strength. Initial heal, health per second, and armor is affected by ability strength as well. Moving on to his fourth ability, Reckoning, quickly lifts enemies into the air and then hurls them down with conviction. Enemies who succumb to this power have a chance to spawn a health orb. So you lift some enemies up and drop them down. The damage it gives is a guaranteed radiation proc, and the damage itself is split between impact and radiation. Enemies that already have radiation on them are dealt additional damage. Enemies that are hit causes enemies that were not hit in the immediate area to be blinded. This part of the ability is kind of strange and not exactly useful from what I've seen. The blind is really low range and duration. Enemies killed by this ability have a 50% chance to drop health orbs, which is not affected by mods. The synergy of this ability with his second ability is enemies hit by Reckoning while standing on the grass of Hallowed Ground get their armor permanently stripped based on the amount found in the abilities page. The armor reduction for multiple casts stacks additively since it affects the base armor, so if I have a 30% strip, it will take 4 casts, which translates to a 120% strip. If I have a 60% strip, it will take 2 casts, which also translates to a 120% strip. In terms of modding, Drain is affected by ability efficiency. Radius and blind radius are affected by ability range. Damage, radiated damage, and armor reduction when cast on enemies in Hallowed Ground is affected by ability strength. Blind duration is affected by ability duration. Moving on to ability augments, starting with Smite Infusion. Smite Augment, holds cast will grant all allies within 15 meters an additional 100% radiation damage to their attacks for 40 seconds. So this is pretty similar to things that Volt, Saren, Ember, and others have. You hold down the ability and it gives you and your allies additional damage of that type. Amount of damage is affected by strength, range is affected by range, and duration affected by ability duration. Moving on to his next augment, Hallowed Eruption. Hallowed Ground augment, reactivate to deal all remaining damage and radiation status. Passive is 100% Hallowed Ground duration. So just as it sounds, however, instead of having multiple Hallowed Grounds at once, when you reactivate it, it blows up for all the remaining damage over time it had left. As a bonus, it adds more duration to the ability, which in turn gives it more damage. So this can make Reckoning look like a joke, except it doesn't have armor strip. This can be made to do so much more damage than Reckoning. The reason I don't use it is because it can be a huge hit or miss on whether it affects enemies in actual gameplay. Reckoning hits up and down, while Hallowed Ground is just enemies on the grass, and it doesn't always register people standing on it. Moving on to his third augment, Phoenix Renewal. Renewal augment, taking fatal damage while under the effects of Renewal will instead heal you or allies to 50% health. This effect triggers only once for each ally every 90 seconds. So this augment basically gives you and allies a free get out of death card. However, the cooldown is really annoying, especially in a scenario where deaths are common. A minute and a half cooldown isn't ideal. However, it does work in arbitrations, and the amount of health it restores is affected by ability strength. Moving on to his fourth augment, Hallowed Reckoning. Reckoning augment. Enemies affected by Reckoning spawn zones that increase armor by 250 for allies and inflicts 150 damage to enemies over 10 seconds. This is pretty shit, and the reason why it's shit is because the only way to get said armor is by standing in really, really, really tiny little things, and as soon as you walk out of it, the buff goes away. So just don't use it. This is so bad. At this point in the video, I like to answer the question, is this frame steel path viable? Can it run arbitrations? Is it part of the Eidolon hunts? So Oberon is actually ideal on the Eidolon hunts because he can give some decent healing and armor to the group, and if he uses his augment for radiation damage, he boosts damage significantly since Eidolons are super weak to radiation damage. I would say the best part about having Oberon in an Eidolon group is that he can spread grass everywhere, which makes you immune to knockdowns and status procs like Magnetic, which happens throughout the fights. And Hydralisk, it also helps if you aren't taking a bunch of damage from the lightning. In other content, I would say he's okay and he can do it, but typically there are better options in my opinion. In lower levels, he excels with his 4th ability killing everything, and his heal and armor strip does good at higher levels, but in Steel Path, it takes way more casts of his Reckoning because of the extra armor Steel Path enemies have. The fact he does radiation damage means he has crowd control integrated right into his kit. Being able to pair that with some tankiness really helps keep him relevant. A quick disclaimer before we get into things. I use an Umbra Forma on my Oberon because of how annoying he is to build, and I have multiple builds using different polarities. Unfortunately, there is no way around this except to just not use the Umbra mods, but this brings his effectiveness down by a ton. I'll be giving non-Umbra versions for some of them that are compatible to have one added later, just so that you can get him going till you can get your hands on an Umbra Forma. A quick mention is that I won't be using Umbral Fiber on these builds because he has ways to get armor through other sources. Because he gets armor from other sources, adding even more armor only adds like 10% extra damage reduction. So this does bring his overall effective health down slightly, but you pretty much won't notice this until you hit like over level 200 content, if at all. Taking out Umbral Fiber allows me to use other mods to help other areas of his kit quite a bit. Okay, for the first build, we have my Battle Druid build. This build is designed to give support to your team while also being super tanky. I have an alternative, more selfish version designed around melee and extra damage. If you're interested in that instead, skip to the next section. In terms of Helminth, you're going to want whatever you want. Honestly, just scroll through the list of Helminth and see if something catches your eye. Personally, nothing caught mine, so I just went for a Roar and I barely even use it. But it can buff your team a bit as well. I don't use Smite Infusion on this build because I would rather give people ability damage and weapon damage using Roar. In terms of Forma, you're looking at one Forma. I use an Umbra Forma for the reason I mentioned in the disclaimer. If you don't have one, here is the build you'll do instead. It takes no Forma, and you can add the Umbra Forma later to make it work. Just keep in mind, it's much weaker without the Umbra. Going over mods, I am starting with Growing Power. The reason for this is because being able to give the team a bit extra ability strength is pretty solid. Additionally, this will allow our heal and armor buff, and even our roar, in my case, to be better. Going over the first two mods, we have Umbra Vitality and Intensify. These just work together to give us our health and strength, because obviously we want a whole bunch of strength for the heal. Next, we have Prime Continuity, and the reason we do this is because it's better to have a little bit more than the base duration, and the reason for that is because it brings our drain per second down a bit, which is kind of nice. Next, we have Prime Flow paired with Hunter Adrenaline. Prime Flow so we can bank a ton of energy that we'll be getting from other sources, specifically Hunter Adrenaline, because it's like one of the best ways to generate energy for someone who takes a lot of hits. Next, we have Transient Fortitude. This brings down our ability duration a bit, unfortunately, but it's better than using something like Blind Rage, which we'd obviously want to keep our renewal up as much as possible, and Blind Rage makes that a little bit difficult for this build. Still, we opted in for Transient Fortitude to still have a bunch of extra strength, without too much negative. Next, we have Stretch, because almost all of his abilities use range. There's pretty much no reason not to have at least some range on this build, which is why I did it this way. Next, I have Adaptation. This is just for harder missions where you're getting hit a lot. I do this 8 out of 10 because the only difference is you need to be shot one additional time and you only lose 2 seconds. Arcanes. In terms of Arcanes, I have Energize and Grace. You have options. If you want to melee, you can just use Strike and Fury. but I would recommend my other build for that. If you want to just camp it out and keep people healed and stuff, I would say Energize and Grace for the healing on yourself is probably the better way to go. In terms of misc requirements, just run something that can kill. Kuva Brahma, Kuvazar, Tenet Envoy are all good options, and there are obviously more than that. I personally use the Brahma on my Oberon, but you can do whatever. For my secondary, I run a Gaze, Splat, and Haymaker kit gun for Pax Bolt. If you use this between casts of Renewal and Hallowed Ground, you'll get extra healing and armor. You can also use this between Roar casts to give yourself quite a bit of extra damage. This is the build I use for it, and it procs Growing Power super easily as well. It does great damage at higher levels. In terms of Operator School, I would say Nariman is okay for melee focus, but on this build, I focus on helping allies and stuff, so I run Vazarin. Zenuric is hard to keep active since you don't generate energy while your heal is active. So quick how to use, basically just get your Growing Power going, get your headshot with your kit gun if you have it, and then press 3. Once you get some energy, you can kill another enemy, then press 2. I missed my headshot for Roar there, but that's fine. From here, you'll have bonus armor and healing for the group if they run into it. Now I'll go into some gameplay of just killing a bunch of things. So in these clips, I forgot to bring my kit gun to give me the extra bonus healing and armor, but it is what it is. As you can see, I just throw down the grass, which helps keep, give me armor and keeps things distracted with the rad procs because they're shooting each other, and then I just go around hammering everything with the Brahma. Next, I go into a quick Acolyte spawn. These Acolytes can one-shot you pretty much no matter what you do, but the fact that you don't take stuns when you're on the ground definitely helps take them out. Okay, moving on to my second Battle Druid build. This build is designed to be a more selfish take on the previous build. It gives more damage to yourself from the augment and even your team, but I don't recommend this for a team build because it goes through energy pretty quickly. This can be a pretty good melee alternative for Oberon. I prefer not to melee because this usually gets you killed at higher levels, and melee is slow to kill compared to AoE attacks. I also really don't recommend meleeing an Acolyte. In terms of Helmuth, you're going to want whatever, just don't replace his first ability as you need it for the augment. I recommend removing his fourth ability if you have to remove anything, but keep in mind that this is a decent quick crowd control. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 2 Forma. You'll add an Umbra Forma and Zenuric to the Exilis. I use an Umbra Forma for the reason I mentioned in the disclaimer. If you don't have one, here is the build you'll do instead. It takes just the Exilis Forma if you have Steel Charge, and you can add the Umbra Forma later to make it work. Just keep in mind it's much weaker without the Umbra Forma. Going over the mods, so starting with the Aura, Growing Power, obviously this just increases the renewal and armor buffs and even your Smite Infusion. This is a no-brainer. However, you can replace this with Steel Charge here if you wanted to. Just keep in mind that you won't be getting the extra strength from those. Going over the other mods, we have the 2 armor mods to boost health and strength. We want to get our strength up as much as possible for Smite Infusion as well as our heal and armor buffs. Smite Infusion is here because it gives you a ton of damage for just holding your first ability. As you can see, it is 269% the way it is, but if I had Growing Power and Pax Bolt, which I'll be mentioning later, that goes up significantly. I think it's like 320 or something like that. Next, we have Prime Flow paired with Hunter Adrenaline. Prime Flow so we can bank a ton of energy, and of course Hunter Adrenaline, which helps us generate a bunch of energy when we get hit, and we'll be getting hit a lot with a melee focus. Next, we have Blind Rage. This brings down our efficiency. This won't be as much of a problem as we will preferably be by ourselves. Again, this is a more selfish take on the previous build. Next, we have Streamline, just so we don't, run out of our heal, and so we're still able to do things as needed. You could replace this with something else if you really wanted to. I just do this just because. Lastly, we have Adaptation because we want to be able to take a bunch of hits. The reason why we're doing this 8 out of 10 is because 10 out of 10 doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for most of my builds. It's how it is. The only difference is you'll have 2 less seconds and you'll need to be shot an additional time to get full stacks. Lastly, we have Power Drift. Obviously, we want to push our strength even further. And moving on to the Arcanes, we have Arcane Strike and Fury. So basically, whenever we get a critical hit, Arcane Fury will proc. It'll give us more melee damage, and Strike, whenever we just get a generic hit, it will have a chance at giving us melee speed. This is very good if we're going to be doing a melee focus, so that's pretty much how that goes. Misc requirements, in terms of misc requirements, just run something that can kill. Since this build is geared more towards melee, I would recommend that. For my secondary, I run Gaze, Splat, and Haymaker Kick Gun for Pax Bolt. If you use this between casts of Renewal and Hollow Ground, you'll get extra healing and armor. Additionally, you can use it between Smite infusions. This is the build I use, and it procs growing power super easily as well. I would just replace Deadhead for Dexterity if you are going for a melee focus. This kick gun does great damage at higher levels. In terms of operator school, I would say Nariman is probably best for the melee focus as the passive. For Power Spike, make sure you're not, losing your entire combo while you are getting your other buffs up or whatever it is you need to be doing. So for a quick how to use, this is essentially the same build as my previous, but you focus on melee instead of camping and maybe using a weapon or whatever. It's also more for solo than the previous version. If you want to see how to use it properly, I covered it earlier. Moving on to my Reckoning build. This build is designed to nuke mid to low level things in bulk. In terms of helmet, you're going to want Dispensary for bonus energy when stationary. If you don't have this, you may still be able to make this work. His fourth ability, which is doing the nuking, has a 50% chance to drop a health orb, which works with Equilibrium to give you energy. However, I doubt this will do much if you have to cast Reckoning more than one at a time to kill things, as it's just really expensive with this build. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 2 Forma. You'll add an Umbra and an Airman to the Aura. Alternatively, do an Aura Forma if you want to use my other builds. I use an Umbra Forma for the reason I mentioned in the disclaimer. If you don't have one, you're out of luck because without it, it's not compatible with my other builds. If you don't care about the other builds and this is the only one you want, you can probably add a couple Forma to make it work instead of the Umbra. So going into the mods, we have Enemy Radar in the Aura to start. You could probably run something like Corrosive Projection, since we're running this at lower levels anyway, but I like Enemy Radar to be able to see what enemies are near me so I know when to cast my 4. Moving on, we have Umbral Intensify to bring up our strength. Next, we have Prime Continuity to bring up our duration so our Hollowed Ground and Dispensary last a decent amount of time. Stretch, as well as Overextended to bring up our range as much as possible. We want like a 360-degree arc on that Hollowed Ground, and we want as much range as we can get on Reckoning. Unfortunately, Overextended brings the strength down a bit, but it is what it is. Next, we have Equilibrium. Pairing this with Dispensary is really good. It gives you so much more energy than normal. Next, we have Transient and Blind Rage to bring up our strength a bunch. Unfortunately, this lowers duration and efficiency a bit. Obviously, the efficiency doesn't particularly matter because you're using Equilibrium and Dispensary, but it is what it is. Next, we have Prime Flow, so we can bank a ton of energy. Obviously, we're going to need a bunch of energy, as our ult obviously costs 155. And I already went overextended. Moving on to the Arcanes, I would recommend something like Energize. Really don't need Guardian. This has enough crowd control and damage potential to not really worry about it, and typically you're using this at lower levels anyway. Moving on to misc requirements. For your pet, you're going to want to run Synth Fiber. This way you can pick up health orbs, which is literally the point of Dispensary, so you're getting energy out of said health orbs. This is not optional, because obviously you need to be picking up those health orbs for the energy to sustain everything. In terms of Operator School, Zenuric is okay. We're not really using our heal, so we'll be able to receive bonuses from Energizing Dash. However, Dispensary and Equilibrium keep this up pretty fine. It's really not required. You can do whatever. So quick how to use. You basically press 1 and wait for some energy. From here you can press 2 a couple times in front and behind you. This will give Reckoning some extra damage on targets affected by radiation, as well as armor strip them. From here you just spam 4 a whole bunch of times. Now I'll go into some quick gameplay of using it in Hydron. So I decided to hop into some Hydron to demonstrate this ability, and basically you just put down your Dispensary like I mentioned earlier, and then you get a couple patches of grass down, and then you just press 4 on everything, and I clear pretty quickly. And I mean, this does work in slightly higher levels than 30. Obviously it won't like insta-kill like the more armored targets like Noxes and heavy gunners and stuff, but it can also armor strip them if they get too close while they're standing on the grass. So, I mean, it does pretty good. It's a pretty quick clear. I mean, that's pretty much all there is to this. Moving on to my last build is my Eidolon build. This build is designed as support for an Eidolon team. In terms of health, really don't need anything. Totally up to you. Just make sure you keep your first, second, and third ability. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 2 Forma. You'll add an Umbra and optionally a Nariman to the aura unless you want to use Deadeye for more sniper damage. Alternatively, do an Aura Forma if you want to use my other builds. Additionally, you'll want a Xenuric on the Exilis. I use an Umbra Forma for the reason I mentioned in the disclaimer. If you don't have one, you're out of luck because without it, it's not compatible with my other builds. So starting with the Aura, keep in mind, you can use either Deadeye or Enemy Radar depending on what you're doing. We don't use Corrosive Projection because there are better ways to strip armor. The reason we would use Enemy Radar is because it makes it easier to find the Vom list if everybody runs it. With this, you can literally see Voms from miles away. Alternatively, if your group still uses snipers, Deadeye can be good for that as well. It's also his default polarity, so you won't have to forma the aura. In terms of other mods, we have Umbra Vitality and Umbra Intensify. This is just to boost strength and health. Next, I have Phoenix Renewal. This doesn't work on lures, but it can help keep your team alive, just so they don't have to res and, drain all their energy, drop more pads. You really don't need this. Honestly, if you really wanted to, you could use something like Smite Infusion if you had to use snipers in the group. This will buff the damage a lot. This is just a flex spot. You can use whatever you want here. Next, we have Prime Flow, so we can bank a ton of energy in case we're taking a lot of damage. Hunter Adrenaline will give us a ton to work with. And of course, we won't be getting drained all the time as long as you're keeping good uptimes on your hollowed ground. Next, we have Prime Continuity because we want our hollowed ground to last a decent amount of time and we don't want to be hitting it every 5 seconds. That pairs pretty well with Streamline, so it doesn't take a ton of energy when we're casting. Moving on to the last mod, we have Stretch, because we obviously don't want base range. We need to be putting this thing everywhere, and this is the best way to do it. Obviously, having more range would be ideal, but we don't really want to sacrifice our other stats. If you really wanted to, in your option slot, you could run something like Augur Reach. That could work. That would probably help a little bit, but you can do whatever you want. Lastly, we have Power Drift, just to bring up our strength even more. In terms of arcanes, I would say Guardian is pretty important, as you may not be always healing yourself and giving yourself armor from your second ability, so just kind of having this up all the time is pretty good. I have Energize here. I would actually recommend something like Grace if you have it. Obviously, this is meant to hunt Eidolon, so that means you probably don't have these things. These things are just an added bonus if you have them. In terms of misc requirements, Sniper can damage the Eidolons, but these days people just use Archibex on the Voidric Necromech, so it's kind of like, it really doesn't matter, but typically you would mod your Sniper for radiation damage. In terms of Operator School, since you're one of the supports in the group, I would say Inaro is a good pick to give your team Inaro Wisps. Alternatively, you can help the Volt kill shields with Materite. Typically, if you have a good Volt in the group, they can one-shot the shields by themselves anyway. So a quick how to use. You're going to spread grass absolutely everywhere near the Eidolon. This will prevent status effects on your team, which helps a ton in Hydralist, but also stops magnetic procs from having everyone getting drained. I'm not going to do gameplay of this because it's super straightforward. Additionally, you can just press 3 occasionally if things are taking a lot of damage. So that is the complete Oberon guide. He is pretty damn good. If you enjoyed the video, or it helped in any way, please leave a like, and if you're looking forward to future content like this, subscribe and stay tuned. If I missed anything, or you'd like to leave some feedback, leave it down in the comments. I appreciate all the support, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.